Next up, we are welcoming back a familiar face to everybody. So Kyle Knopff is a wildlife biologist with Golder. And he presented yesterday on estimating nutritional carrying capacity. And today he's going to be discussing mountain goat response to human activity in Jasper. So take it away, Kyle.
Thank you, Jenna. All right, as Jenna mentioned, today I'll be telling you about some work that we did over the last decade or so with mountain goats associated with the Glacier Skywalk in Jasper National Park. And like yesterday, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, my wife, Alia, and my colleague, Martin Yalkotzi, were instrumental in the work that I'm going to describe to you today. So the project that I want to talk about today is the Glacier Skywalk. And if you have been to Jasper National Park, it's likely that you have seen the skywalk off of the highway as you drive through the park. And the Glacier Skywalk at the time we started working on this project was a proposed interpretive attraction that would redevelop the Sunwapta viewpoint, which is at the, prior to development of the Glacier Skywalk, the Sunwapta viewpoint was a pullout off of the highway through Jasper National Park, where you could go and stand and look up at the Athabasca Glacier, and you could see, the views from that location were pretty outstanding. And so the proposal was to develop a walkway that would allow people to have those same views, but also to stand out over the river valley and look down through a glass-floored platform. Jasper National Park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the project at the time of its proposal was controversial. And one of the key issues that was raised with respect to the project is what would the impacts of this be on mountain goats? Because there's a mountain goat population that lives right there and spends a lot of time around the Sunwapta viewpoint. And the focus on goats was because, as I mentioned, they commonly use the site. And mountain goats frequently demonstrate low tolerance for human activity, although as we've seen in a couple of presentations here at this session, there are cases where, for example, where minerals in human urine in the one example were present, where goats would potentially exhibit some habituation or willingness to occur near people. But in general, what we find in the literature is that goats have low tolerance for human activity. And in this case, the degree to which goats could adjust their behavior to accommodate, disturbance, it's generally poorly understood, and we had some uncertainty about that. And there was some concern that goats might actually abandon the site as it was developed for this viewpoint. So we were brought on, Golder's a consulting firm, and we came on to help Brewster at the time understand potential impacts of the project and to help them provide some sustainable solutions, and also to develop, to try to develop a successful project that wouldn't have particularly high impacts to goats. And the period over which we conducted our work was 2011 to 2019. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today is we started with some baseline data collection and an environmental assessment in 2011. The project did receive approval and was constructed 2012 and 2013. And we did monitoring during that construction period, and then we initiated sort of a longer term monitoring program for operations in 2014. And that ran through until 2019. So those are the data from this whole program is what I'm presenting today. So in 2011, we did some baseline work at the Sunwapta viewpoint. And this area had been regularly used by people for decades prior to the project. And so we had cameras out doing some work, we had cameras out as part of our work to detect goats, to understand how and when they used the site. We also did a lot of behavioral observations and just general observations of the site to better understand how goats were using it. And what we found was, I should also mention that we monitored human use of the site as well through a camera, just counting number of vehicles parked in the parking lot. And what we found was that during the summer months, the site is very heavily and regularly used by people, but also by goats. And goat activity was highest, especially in the early morning and late evening, and the use seasonally peaked in June and early July and declined thereafter. And goats we found were present even when visitor rate was very high. So the goat attraction to the sun-wafted viewpoint, we, through some observations of their behavior, they spent a lot of time licking, and you'll see that a little bit later, but we think that it was primarily to obtain minerals, likely salt that was deposited on the road at that location. There's a ton of escape terrain immediately adjacent to the highway there, and so it was a good spot for them to come and obtain those minerals and also be safe from predators. So we undertook an environmental assessment, and based on our observations of how goats were using the site prior to the project, we concluded, or we predicted, that goats would be adversely affected, especially by construction, and that short-term displacement was possible. However, during operations, we anticipated that the impacts would be lower and that the risk of long-term site abandonment was low. And we made those predictions based on our observations of high goat use, even during periods when human use was very high at the sun-wafted viewpoint. But we also identified some uncertainty in this conclusion and recommended that that be evaluated through long-term monitoring, and that was what was done and what we implemented. So, as I mentioned, we had a camera monitoring program that we initiated for the baseline program, and that's what you're seeing here. So this is on the right-hand side of your screen is what is the sun-wafted viewpoint. The glacier skywalk is now located right about here. This area here is an open set of cliffs and talus slopes leading down to the river. And here's Highway 93 running through Jasper National Park. The old viewpoint pullout was right about here. So what we did was we set up some cameras on trails all around the site, and also a series of cameras down here facing up towards the cliffs. These cameras on trails took images on motion triggers, whereas the cameras facing the cliffs took images every 15 minutes. And then we just counted the number of goats that we could see in those images on the cliffs. In addition, construction was not completed as planned in 2012. So the environmental assessment suggested that construction would have the largest impact on mountain goats, and we thought that short-term site abandonment was possible. So we recommended that construction not occur in May, June, and July when goat use at the site was highest. And Parks Canada agreed with that and had a condition where construction would occur outside of the high use window. But for technical reasons, construction was not completed in 2012 in the fall. And Brewster sought approval from Parks Canada to continue construction, not during June when goat use was highest, but during May and July. Parks Canada approved that, but only under the condition that mountain goats were monitored during those periods. And so we did ad-limited and focal animal sampling during those periods, watching goats intensely. And so we have some really good data from that too to share with you today. So all that, and what did we find? Well, one of the really interesting things and kind of surprising to us was that goats did not abandon the site during construction. And construction was pretty intensive, as you can see in these pictures. So we've got overhead workings with cranes operating. We had blasting for support structures that were put into the cliffs. You can see here the skywalk itself under construction and being built out over these cliffs. And we found that goats used the site immediately around the construction area. You see in these pictures here, and also immediately under the construction area. Our observations, we would actually stop blasting if the goats were too close to the blast zone. But other than that, we allowed construction to proceed essentially and observed the goat behavior. And there's very little response to any of the construction activities. So what happened during the long-term monitoring? Here we have I've got 4 slides to share with you on this. Here we have the trail cameras that I described. So these are the motion trigger cameras. And what I'm showing here is temporal use. And you can see each of the years. 2011 is the baseline year prior to the project. 2012 and 2013 are the construction years. And then from 2014 onwards are the operational years. And what you see is that generally the pattern and amount of use is extremely consistent. There was one completely off year in 2016 when goats spent a huge amount of time in front of a few of the trail cameras, and therefore we have these very high rates of use. That did not also reflect, you'll see in a minute, on those cliff cameras where use in 2016 was very similar to other years. So this just seems to be an anomaly where for some reason they wanted to stand directly in front of the cameras. But you can see overall the pattern's very clear, highest use occurring early in the morning and especially later in the day. And here are the cliff camera data. I didn't show them all here. This is a slightly different slide. You can see 2019 as an example year, and then the average of 2011 to 2018 running through. And again, very similar patterns on the cliffs in terms of temporal use. You see goats there earlier in the morning and later in the evening primarily, but they occur on the cliffs all throughout the day. So what about season? So again, these are the trail cameras and we see the anomalous 2016 year, but in general, the pattern was very similar. So we had low use, almost none at the beginning of May, and then goats came into the area, were very prevalent through June and then declined out through the remainder of the summer. We stopped our monitoring each year in October, and so we didn't monitor through the winter months. We don't have data for that period, but just the summer. And here are the cliff cameras. Again, you're seeing very high use late May, June, July, throughout all years. There is variation among the years and the amount of use, but it kind of bounces up and down, and the pattern remains essentially the same throughout the monitoring period 2011 to 2018. So the impacts were actually less than we predicted in our environmental assessment. The goats didn't really change their behavior, did not respond to construction. They seem to be, in essence, in this area, I'm not sure what the right word to use is, but probably habituation is a good one. They seem to not respond strongly to the presence of people. Here's an example from one of our cameras where you've got a goat and you can see all the people standing out on the skywalk. The reason for this is likely because there are high quality minerals present. So goats spent 30% of the time during behavioral observations licking rocks. And here's an image of an example of that kind of behavior. Or they were up licking on the road itself. Now, this rock face here is immediately below the road, and it's possible that road salts are leaching out through it, or that there are natural mineral sources available here at this location. So overall, our conclusions after 10 years of study were that goats accessed the site primarily to obtain minerals. They did not abandon the site during construction. They were observed on the cliffs at the same time, at the same day as blasting, and were present during periods of very high human use during operations. Again, you can see this goat framing with its horns, all the people standing here on the skywalk. Some mountain goat populations, therefore, seem to be able to accommodate high levels of human activity. And we think this might be particularly due to the presence of minerals. So it seems like that is such an important resource that perhaps goats are willing to take greater risks and spend more time around people. And I apologize, this final bullet is incomplete, but the full set of mechanisms for this are not fully understood, like how they habituate and how they initially are able to overcome the general pattern of avoidance of human disturbance that we see is uncertain and likely occurred at this site decades potentially prior to the implementation of the skywalk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks for that, Kyle. We've actually got a few coming in, so I'll start with the first one here. And the question is, was there an attempt to measure stress levels with fecal cortisol?
Very good question. There was not. We didn't investigate stress. So it's certainly possible that the goats did experience higher levels of stress. We didn't notice any kind of physiological responses. Rates of kids were very good. So from a population level, we didn't see anything to indicate a problem there, but good question. We did not measure stress through fecal cortisol.
The next one here is the population exposed to hunting at all?
No, this population is inside Jasper National Park. So I think that's a really good question and a key point to make. These goats are not exposed to hunting. A hunted population of mountain goats might respond quite differently to human presence and pressure. And we see the same thing, for example, with elk in the parks, which are willing to have people approach them quite closely in some cases, whereas if you were outside of the parks in one of the zones where hunting is common, elk are very wary of people and will move away from them quickly if they detect them.
Thank you. The next one here is, what was the proportion of males and females that would hang around Skyview, and were those the same animals? So you might have missed some goats.
So we didn't have individual identification of mountain goats. We did, in many cases on our images, we had trouble discerning males from females. You know, females with kids obviously were a bit easier, but sometimes we would only have the rump of a goat or part of a goat in the image, or not enough of the goat to try to detect sex. So we do know for sure that we had all age sex classes accessing the site. We did not have individuals marked. We also detected bighorn sheep at these sites, and in that case we were able to identify individuals that, especially rams, that returned over many years, but unfortunately with the goats, we couldn't make the same conclusions.
Perfect, thanks for that. It looks like there are a few other questions coming around on that. And so another one is, any population or demographic changes observed?
Yeah, really good question. I think I partially answered that before. We did not observe any from the kind of data we had. So we had, we had camera data, we had really great rates of kids with nannies, but we didn't actually measure change in the population overall. So difficult to say. We have only, we can only say so much with the data we have.
Perfect, thank you. Looks like you've answered most of the other ones that came through. So really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So next up,